Sasha Alenko here. I help write and produce the Reconnect America podcast. Twice a decade, Congress gets together to map out the next 5 years of policy for the nation's railroads, roads, pipelines, and some aspects of its inland waterways. Though the specific bill they produce is usually given a unique name, this type of legislation is known as a Surface Transportation Reauthorization. The last Surface Transportation Reauthorization came in 2021 as part of the Biden administration's Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the BIL, also known as the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the IIJA. That legislation contained many historic investments in rail. In particular, it aimed to expand, rehabilitate, and upgrade the nation's chronically neglected passenger rail network. As the title of the bill suggests, the process for crafting it was truly a bipartisan effort, and its benefits were distributed across the country. That was 5 years ago. The time has now come for a new Surface Transportation Reauthorization, and the bill that the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee has put forward is being called the Build America 250 Act. But instead of the prolific expansion that the name seems to imply, this legislation actually threatens to drastically diminish the public support that our passenger rail system needs in order to function, and it undermines the efficacy of some of the hallmark programs of the 2021 bill. Jim Matthews, president of the Rail Passengers Association, has been deeply involved in the process of crafting this bill over the past several months. And though his appreciation for the staffers who got it to where it is today is beyond dispute, he believes that this bill is simply not adequate and that it must go back to the drawing board. To better understand where the Build America 250 Act falls short, how we can close that gap, and the deeper vision underpinning this fight, Reconnect America host Bill Moyer got in touch with Mr. Matthews for an expansive conversation. Though the interview is on the longer side, I think you'll find it highly engaging and that it gets to the heart of some of the most pressing challenges of our time. Here is Bill's conversation with Jim Matthews.
Welcome, Jim Matthews. It's about time that we finally made this happen. We've been talking about it, I think, for a couple of years. So I really appreciate you making time in your day to have a conversation with Reconnect America.
No, happy to do it. Long overdue. It's great to see you, Bill.
So, I was thinking about when we first met, and I think it was in Denver for a Rail Passengers Association convention. And somehow, I think Sean had invited me to be on a panel, or you all had invited me to be on a panel when Solutionary Rail was brand new, right? We were just trying to remember if we even had the book out yet.
You did, because we gave away a copy of the book as a kind of a raffling deal.
Nice. I'm glad. That's probably the most money that's ever been raised for a copy of the Solutionary Rail book. And it was probably maybe $20-$30. All right, ready to go. And I remember also because I was on a panel with Brightline, someone from Brightline, and Brightline was kind of a new and shiny object at that moment. And, it might come up in our conversation today because it seems like Brightline is potentially a little bit of an object lesson in how rail in this country, or maybe in general for passengers, how passenger rail works or doesn't work, and how sometimes it can get started, but maybe the long-term trajectory isn't quite as clear as the original vision. So I think it'd be good to sort of start at the beginning and recognize that this country has a unique setup for rail in that our railroads are privately owned for the most part, and the operators are private corporations, and that before 1971, there was really not much of a distinction between freight railroads and passenger railroads, because railroads who had been helped by the government to create this infrastructure, it's really critical infrastructure, they were required to provide service to passengers. And so in your recollection of that history and that sort of pivot, what happened to that obligation that the freight railroads had, and what was the outcome, at least in the immediate? Is that a fair question to ask?
Yeah, no, it is. And I think First of all, I'm really glad you brought up the fact that, yes, these were private railroads operating on their own infrastructure, but it was infrastructure that was made possible through federal government support and intervention over the years.
Right.
We can't lose sight of that. In any industry that has a large sort of capital intensive requirement, you're never going to see private industry be able to take on that level of scale and risk all by itself. It's just historically just never happened. Same was true for the railroads, going all the way back to the land grants they got to build their right of way and all the rest. So what was happening was in the 60s, you had basically subsidized forms of transportation competing against the railroads, which by that time were largely unsubsidized. Yes, they had that sort of original push from not having to go buy their land and all the other things that we've talked about. But by the 1960s, if you look at the amount of federal dollars that was going into supporting rail versus aviation or highways or even barges for that matter, even boats, it was way, 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 way down on the list. And so, this is something we all learned in the very first economics class we ever took, is that you have subsidized competition going against something that's unsubsidized. The unsubsidized is going to lose. And that's what was happening. The railroads were really getting hammered, and they were trying to get rid of their passenger services because they were terribly expensive to operate. And the railroads generally were just losing money. And the regulatory structure at the time said you had to go to the federal government and ask permission to drop service. And you had to do that every time. So every single route became a kind of litigation over, can we drop this service? What does it do? Is it essential? And all the rest. And so the existential crisis that was facing passenger rail back then was pretty severe. And so that's why we have an Amtrak. Amtrak was born in 1971 to absorb the passenger service that those private operators wanted to get rid of. So the whole point was to provide that public service that private capital could no longer afford to provide while delivering a return to their shareholders.
Right.
It was a market failure, and that's okay. That's what government's for. Government comes in when there's a market failure. And so that's how we wound up where we are. And you asked about what are they required to do? Well, it's actually pretty simple. There was a quid pro quo. The taxpayers of the United States agreed, we will take all your liabilities, we'll take your pension liabilities, we'll take your debt, we'll take your rolling stock, we'll take your maintenance, we'll take all that stuff. We'll take that off your hands. And in exchange, we're going to run the passenger service that you are obligated as a common carrier to provide. We'll run it for you. And we'll even pay you a per mile charge for putting those trains on your tracks. But the quid pro quo is you got to let us go first. You got to let us run these trains in a way that gets them there on time. That was it. That was the quid pro quo. It was a really great deal from the point of view of the private railroads, who got to throw away all that liability in exchange for somebody else doing the thing that they were legally obligated to do. So a great deal for them.
Right. A great deal for them. They were legally obligated to do it. And it's not because it was profitable. We were doing a bunch of research on the passenger rail history in the US, and we found that passenger versus freight, like what was the revenue that was adequate to pay for the operations and the infrastructure. And they only started tracking that in 1936, where they parsed out freight from passenger service. And there were only 4 years since 1936 where the passenger service revenue was enough to pay for their operations and infrastructure costs. And that was during World War II. Those were the only 4 years when people were forced through rationing to have to ride the trains. The railroads weren't allowed to do much improvement anyway because of rationing of steel, et cetera. So the whole time, we have no actual record of passenger rail being a source of profit for business or anyone else. So in the beginning of Amtrak, it seemed like it was created with this unfair obligation or mandate to somehow be generating a profit when it didn't actually have a history of doing that. Is there anything you'd like to say about that and why that onus was placed on it? And then what happened as we move forward?
Boy, oh boy, you have pushed a very hot button for me. I could talk about the Amtrak profit thing for hours and hours until forcibly stopped. But let's just start with, you're right. In 1971, when Amtrak was born, they were saddled with this clause that said that it was going to try and make a profit. And first of all, the whole thing is just benighted, right? Because there is not an airline in the United States that would make a profit if they had to pay for air traffic control, if they had to pay for their own airports, if they had to pay for their own gates, pay for all the things that passenger rail has to pay for to run its services. I almost hate the terms of the debate because it always winds up being, well, why can't Amtrak turn a profit? Well, none of it turns a profit. But let's set that aside and we'll just look at Amtrak generally. So in 1971, yes, there was a clause that said you should try to make a profit. But in 1978, Congress changed its mind. And since 1978, it has never required Amtrak to make a profit. The Congressional Research Service looked at that and put out a report in 2002, kind of trying to correct the misperception even in Congress itself. The Congressional Research Service was pretty clear. No, it's not required to make a profit. Y'all changed it in 1978, and it's still true. The Supreme Court has ruled twice that Amtrak is not a private company. And then in 2021, of course, when we got the IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, whichever tag you want to put on it, Congress explicitly stripped profit-making out of Amtrak's to-do list, line by line. So yes, there was this weird idea that, we were going to try and make a profit, blah, blah, blah. But I hate to sound like a lawyer here, but the term that's been put into that legislation is operated and managed as a for-profit corporation. So what that actually means, everyone can sort of debate what that means, but the best way to figure out what something means is you go back to the report of the legislators who wrote the bill and say, hey, what did they mean? Because usually they will tell you what they mean in their report. And in the report on that provision, the committee at the time was the House Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee, which is now the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. But it said in their bill, Section 9 amends Section 301 of the Rail Passenger Service Act to conform the law to reality, providing that Amtrak shall be operated and managed as a for-profit corporation. This amendment recognizes that Amtrak is not a for-profit corporation. Bam. That's it. That's what Congress said they meant. And we've been debating this ever since. And it's like, well, wait a minute. No, there's no reason to debate this. Amtrak is not required to make a profit. Congress wrote the law so that it didn't have to make a profit. And every Congress since then that has had the opportunity to make it a profit requirement again has declined to do that, even when controlled solidly by those who think that Amtrak and anything should be profitable. So it's just a strange anomaly because Amtrak is shaped like a company. It kind of looks like a company, but it's a company whose board of directors is nominated by the White House, whose members serve with the advice and consent of the Senate. They're organized to carry out an explicitly public purpose using public funds. So no less a flaming liberal than Justice Antonin Scalia wrote that Amtrak functions as a government agency to carry out an explicit public purpose. So we keep having this idea that, well, Amtrak's a bad company. And sometimes, depending on the political mood, Amtrak encourages this. Oh, we're a company. Don't do that. These are conversations I've had with my friends at Amtrak in leadership for a long time. And I've always argued, and I will do it here again today. It is exactly the wrong thing for Amtrak to stand up and say, we can be a good company. Because you're operating with so many cinder blocks tied around your ankles, you're never going to be a profitable company in the way that Americans understand profit-making companies to be. So don't be that. Don't pretend that, because that's not what you're going to be. What you are is a government agency that recovers close to 90% of its costs through user fees. Well, that's a pretty good story. Stick with it.
Yeah, that's pretty damn good. Yeah. Yeah. And I assume that in your role as president and CEO of Rail Passengers Association, that you get a chance to meet other folks involved in passenger rail in other parts of the world.
I do.
And everybody says, oh, yeah, if only we could be like this place or that place or have this kind of train or that kind of train. And is there any place in the world where rail is treated simply as a profit-making entity?
No, nope. And, I get into this discussion sometimes with people and they say, well, what about Japan? Well, okay. But again, they were launched and supported in an infrastructure way through the Japanese taxpayer. And those high-speed rail lines continue to enjoy significant government support in terms of infrastructure and all the rest. So, one of the terms you'll hear a lot is above the rail. And it's probably important for people to recognize. Can rail service be profitable above the rail, meaning minus all the infrastructure? There are places where it can be, including in the US. The Amtrak trains that run through Virginia, for example, down to places like Newport News and Norfolk and places like that, they're producing about a $28 to $30 surplus per passenger for every ticket they sell. That's above the rail. As I said earlier, if they have to buy all the rail and the signaling and all the other things that go with it, now it's not going to be profitable. And that's okay, because the profit doesn't go to Amtrak. It goes to the communities served. And when you look at countries around the world who look at rail as a public good, as a public benefit, they have the good sense to look at what that rail does for the rest of their economy and for the communities that it serves. And it's unthinkable to them to turn it off. They just look at it and go, well, I don't care if each run makes a profit or not. The town is thriving because it has rail service. So that's what we're going to do. If we could just adopt that mindset where we recognize the sort of global benefit to an economy, to the communities, to the states of having this service, because it does bring prosperity. It does make lives better. It does actually produce value and benefit that is greater than the dollars that we put in. It's kind of the definition of a profit. It's just the profit doesn't go to Amtrak. And overseas, it doesn't go to Deutsche Bahn or JR Rail or any of the rest. They recognize that there is a public good in making sure that people can get where they have to go, that people can go to school, that people can go to work, that businesses can send their people back and forth around their country on the rails. The conservative talking point these days is frictionless, right? Everything has to be frictionless. So there's nothing between you and spending your money on the things they want you to spend your money on. But you know what? Rail is the ultimate, right? Because it takes all that out. It's fast, it's efficient, it's cheap, it can be cheap. All of those things that they say they want, rail does that. But there's just this strange cultural aversion to recognizing that infrastructure is a function of government, and very often is the reason why supposed private enterprises in the United States are so profitable, because they exist in an ecosystem of federally and state subsidized beneficence, I guess I'll use the word.
Yeah, that brings up a few thoughts. One is, when was the last time we ever heard anybody asking a freeway to turn a profit?
That's a really good thing to bring up, because this year, it looks pretty likely that our friendly neighborhood highway trust fund, which has been insolvent for years, they're going to have to, in this authorization, they're going to have to shovel another bunch of money, hundreds of millions of dollars, to make the highway trust fund solvent, because the highway trust fund doesn't make money from gas taxes. It only covers about half of the costs of running the highways. The rest of it comes from general tax funds. So highways aren't profitable by any measure.
We'll get to conversation about rolling stock, but I think about highways and I think, like, wow, all these individuals are providing rolling stock constantly with their cars, and such. And it's like, there's, I think, a metric of per passenger mile cost. And people like to talk about, oh, it's like a penny per passenger mile for passengers on the freeways. I'm not sure. I mean, this is a vague memory I have, and then I think about, wow, but what about the cost of all those cars? And not that I want to get into an anti-car rant here or whatever, but I want to be real about who's actually paying for what. And if we're paying for freeways and roads, what on earth is keeping us from paying for service on rails? Rails are literally the least amount of friction for ground transportation. And we have this massive 140,000 mile infrastructure that could be far more utilized, and we're failing to do so. And it's also interesting to me that the railroad companies, the private corporations that control that infrastructure, and they profit from their market control of that infrastructure by controlling who and what travels on it and for how much and for how long, that they aren't telling a very good story. They certainly haven't chimed in to champion passenger rail. Sometimes I liken them to the Obi-Wan Kenobi first Star Wars movie, where they're coming through and the stormtroopers are saying, checking out the droids. And he's like, these are not the droids you're looking for. And they're like, oh, these are not the droids we're looking for.
He can go about his business. Move
He
along.
goes about his business, right? Right. And it's like, I feel like that's a pretty apt metaphor for how the Class 1 railroads hide from the public because of the fact that they are critical national infrastructure. They have a public purpose and public mandate. And so we get caught up in this mythology of the automobile and these weird things like the passenger trains are supposed to turn a profit. And we're kind of blind to the potential and the opportunities of this rail infrastructure. And it feels to me that the private rail companies collude in that absence from our collective imagination.
You know what? It's funny. I think they all believe that. I think, collusion implies that they're sitting in a room saying, let's figure out how to do this. I don't think they have to. I think they genuinely believe this. So I don't think they need to collude to send that message. I think this is something that's kind of baked into their DNA. And the thing is, there is no reason in the world why private railroads could not succeed with help from government entities on infrastructure. And it's funny how this makes me think about this. The big boy classic locomotive has been touring the country, and this is what is frankly a PR stunt to support the Union Pacific Norfolk Southern merger. And, everyone's excited about it. And it's okay. And they should be excited. And it's a beautiful locomotive. And I love that stuff as much as anybody else. But let's be real about what it is, right? But think about, it's not just the locomotive. That train is a bunch of Union Pacific office cars and passenger cars. So you look at it and it's, bringing along the crews and some of the executives and the whatever, but it's a passenger train.
Wow.
And so tens of thousands of people have come out at every place along the right of way to wave and take pictures and get excited at a passenger train. And it's just amazing to me that they see that and they can't connect the dots in their minds and say, because they're all saying things like, wow, this is great. Wow, wouldn't it be great to ride that train? Well, you got 305 trains a day today to choose from that you can ride. So there really is a kind of mental block to recognizing the service that could be there, that's very possible. It's an ideological blind spot. It really, truly is. And I think it goes back many, many decades to the point where we started demonizing government and government expertise. The old Reagan joke about the most terrifying words in history is I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Well, if you've been through a hurricane or a tornado, those aren't particularly terrifying words. They're actually words that you welcome. But that's a whole nother conversation. But we've put ourselves in an ideological box. And I'm not going to sit here and argue for one side of the ideology or another. I'm kind of a fact-based guy. And if people want to ride trains, which all the numbers suggest that they do, Amtrak's ridership continues to set records. Amtrak continues to be unable to service the demand that it has because it doesn't have enough cars to do it. You send a classic locomotive across the country and hundreds of thousands of people come out and camp overnight to take pictures of it as it goes by. People want to ride the train. There's no reason why We couldn't have more trains, but we have put ourselves in an ideological box that says we can't.
Right. And I wonder, though, does Union Pacific remember, do these railroads that currently control these monopoly duopolies, do they remember the deal that was made in 1970 to relieve them of that obligation, but to provide access to their tracks? It sure didn't seem like they believed it when Norfolk Southern was being asked to restore service down in the southeast of the country. The Mardi Gras service, that took nearly 20 years, you pointed out, to restore that very limited amount of service. And
19 years and 11 months, to be precise.
exactly. There you go. There you go. 19 years, 11 months, and people love it, right?
Yes. The base fare on that train is $15.
Oh my God.
But the demand has been so high that typically you're paying about 50, $60 to ride that train just because of the demand. We did some research at the association. One of the things we do is we do economic modeling on passenger rail service. And one of the things that our data science team discovered was that you could probably justify 5 coaches on each of the 2 Mardi Gras trains every day to satisfy the demand. And right now it operates with 2 or 3 coaches, depending on the time of the week. So people are bursting at the seams on these trains. People want to take these trains. And so the demand is there. And one of the things that I think is deeply disingenuous is when critics of passenger rail say, oh, nobody's riding the trains. Nobody wants to do it. People prefer to drive. Look at all this data about all the car trips. Well, they're driving because that's the only option. It's not necessarily a preference. When that's the only choice you have, that's what you're going to do. And so that's a really disingenuous way to look at it. And in the meantime, the freight railroads, they're called the Class 1 railroads, they haven't forgotten that provision, but they will argue that it is outdated, that it is time to revisit the grand bargain, because within railroading, we call that the grand bargain. And could you make a case that Amtrak maybe should be paying a little bit more per mile? Maybe. But I think that is a decision that the Surface Transportation Board ought to be making as the economic regulator. Just like if I'm shipping corn or shipping grain or rocks or whatever I'm shipping, and I don't like my rate and I feel like I'm being abused, I can go to the STB and I can open a rate case. And they will look at it and say, oh, well, this is what the rate ought to be. It's a very technical analysis. It looks a lot like a court of law, but it's a very specialized court of law. And so if we want to talk about that, maybe that's a good way to talk about it. But to pretend that this is just an outdated idea, no. And Congress, for the past 46 Congresses, has continued to leave the provision in law that says that Amtrak trains must get priority dispatch. 46 Congresses have had the opportunity to turn that off. And 46 Congresses, whether they're under Republicans or Democrats, is irrelevant, have chosen not to do that. So it is clear that the people of the United States, acting through their elected representatives, have made the policy choice that they want passenger trains on these tracks. So if that's where we are, then if I'm a Class 1 CEO, I'm saying to myself, okay, how do I work within this system? How do I benefit from this system? How do I get what I need from this system? How do I serve my shareholders, my customers, and follow the law at the same time? And, I look at the on-time performance of Amtrak trains that operate on Canadian Pacific territory, now it's CPKC. And for years and years and years and years, their on-time performance has been pretty decent. And there's always stuff that gets in the way. There's landslides, there's mudslides, there's snow. There's stuff that happens, but by and large, statistically, CPKC does a great job of running Amtrak trains on time. And so there's clearly a way to do it. Somehow the geometry and the physics don't stop CPKC from running Amtrak trains on time and from running Amtrak trains in a way that doesn't crush CPKC's business, because they are, by all accounts, a profitable railroad, profitable enough that their CEO was able to get a multi-million-dollar bonus. So they must be doing okay. So there's a way for all of this to coexist if we would just accept that and not push so hard on this idea that, well, we got to tear up the grand bargain and toss passenger rail aside. Well, if you're if you're Jim Vena, and I doubt Jim Vena listens to this podcast, but if he does, Jim, look out the window from the office car at all those people lined up to watch your train go by. Don't you think those people would like to ride a train and would pay fares to do it? Come on. Let's just accept where we are. People want to ride these trains, and they'll ride them if they're there. And if they get you where you got to go reasonably safely and on time and all the rest, people want to do it.
Right.
And I could see a future in which the federal government, and this is just me talking. This is not necessarily the position of the Rail Passengers Association formally. We haven't really adopted it. But I could see a world in which the infrastructure is owned and managed by the federal government, and everyone gets to operate on it. And to me, that analogy is like the air traffic control system. The air traffic control towers are, for the most part, there's a few contract towers, but for the most part, those are federal installations, and those are federal employees, and their median salary is about $150,000 a year, an amount I am happy to pay so that we continue to have safe skies. So, I'm not sitting here saying that we should cut that. I'm saying that that is an example of something we've decided as a policy matter is important enough to pay for. And if I took a typical US airline flight from, say, Los Angeles to Baltimore, transcontinental flight, that flight is touched by 24 air traffic controllers of one sort or another. And we operate thousands of flights like that every single day in the United States. And that is a taxpayer expense. And nobody argues about that. And nobody should argue about that. That is an appropriate role for the federal government. It creates the preconditions for the success of private capital so that Delta can do its thing, and American can do its thing, and Southwest can do its thing. Because if they had to buy all those air traffic controllers and train them and cycle them out and all the rest, I mean, as it is, most airline tickets, the margin on a single airline ticket is generally less than $5, which people don't really realize. But margins in airlines are terrible. And that's one reason why now they're charging you, $75 for a window seat and $35 to take a bag, and the old joke about Ryanair trying to charge you for using the bathroom. That's the pressure, and it's real. And so the idea that these guys are profitable because they're smart businesses and Amtrak is just bad. No. If Amtrak had the deal that the airlines had, they'd be doing just fine. Thank you very much. So I can see a world in which that playing field is leveled. You could have a Union Pacific premium train that operates 3 times a week and charges people $5,000 for Orient Express, whatever. Fine, knock yourself out. And Amtrak takes the college student from rural America to school.
Right.
Or the veteran to this one and only veterans hospital that's operating in their state. That's okay. They're all in the same infrastructure. That's okay. I can see a world in which that happens.
It's hard for me to actually see a world where that doesn't happen, that actually works. And it feels like it's almost a forbidden topic to raise. But when you think about the interstate system or the post office or the rural electric system, these are publicly subsidized, absolutely essential infrastructure that private companies might want to have some piece where there's a high profit margin, a lot of density, but they don't want to mess with a rural place. And we learn that through history. And that's why the public intervenes and makes that investment. Some people have called this vision a steel interstate.
Mm-hmm.
Why wouldn't we do that? I mean, if we had and this kind of is not a terrible transition to our discussion, I think, of the Surface Transportation Reauthorization, because the Surface Transportation Reauthorization has been historically really focused on roads and such. And I'll let you speak more clearly about how it's evolved over time. But if we had a national transportation policy that was actually trying to rationalize the modes that we have at our fingertips to use, the roads, the air, rail, waterways, and we could figure out, well, what's the best bang for the buck on each of those modes? How do we create the most vital, resilient, and robust system? We wouldn't be just focusing on the highways. We'd be thinking as a whole system. And in that whole system, you'd want that infrastructure to be, yes, well maintained. You'd want it to continue to reach the places that are less profitable to reach or not profitable to reach, which is kind of an important thing. I mean, one of the things we've seen since 1970 is a loss of tens of thousands of miles of track and service, places that are literally being left behind for passenger service as well as for freight. So your out of the box thinking there, to me, feels like the only transportation future I can imagine that's really worth having.
Sure. I mean, I agree. I mean, certainly that is the only transportation future that's worth having. The trouble is, will we deserve it? We have erected ourselves by choice so many political, bureaucratic, and ideological obstacles to doing something like that. They're both direct and easy to understand in the form of, airlines wanting everybody to fly and all the rest. But there's also some indirect obstacles, which I don't think we necessarily connect the dots on, but they're very much part of the conversation. So for one, we've spent the better part of 6 decades telling people that the only things that are worth doing are things that make a profit. It has become an almost religious argument. It is a point of faith. You either believe it or you don't. And so we now have the spectacle of prisons in the United States being operated on a for-profit basis, because apparently that's the only way we measure things, is whether they make a profit or not. And so in that context, we have shackled ourselves so that we start with looking at a solution that might be mode agnostic. And as you say, kind of look at the best use of every mode and so forth. We can never get there in the current American environment because the American people have been propagandized over the past 6 decades or more into believing that the only thing that's worth doing is something that makes a profit. And if it doesn't make a profit, you got to throw it out of the idea pile. And, I was involved a few years ago in something called the National Advisory Commission on Travel and Tourism Infrastructure. That was a congressionally directed committee to study this kind of problem. And we had representatives from rental car companies and airlines and the airports and the convention and visitors bureaus. And I mean, just anyone you can imagine. I was the only rail voice on that committee, by the way. And I will say that everybody on the committee, regardless of mode, really did have a good faith desire to do exactly what you described, because this was about mapping out future infrastructure investment in travel modes for the Department of Transportation to look at as a kind of blueprint. And the obstacles that we spent some time talking about, well, do we have to do things in a way that make a profit? That was a legitimate debating point within this group, because there was a sense that, well, if it's not going to be profitable, we're not going to be able to get it to be done. And I would always say, well, why not? Last time I looked, the U.S. Air Force didn't make a profit. Northrop Grumman sure does. But the Coast Guard doesn't make a profit. The National Weather Service doesn't make a profit. And of course, having brought up the National Weather Service, we now have people who think that AccuWeather should be doing it instead of the National Weather Service. So there, I'm hoisted on my own petard. But this is where the conversation starts. And these were people who were genuinely trying. None of these people were cynical. They were genuinely trying to make this attempt at coming up with this. But if you believe in the ideology, if you believe in it in a kind of religious, faith-based way, you can't see a world in which profit is not important. You can't. You look at it and go, you must be crazy. Well, no, we're not crazy. And I found that when I explained the connection to people that said that, look, the federal government and to some extent state governments have always had a role in spending selectively to create the preconditions for the success of private capital, then the light bulb would go off. And then we would be able to have substantive discussions about how we might invest to produce the benefits that we're trying to produce from transportation. And another thing that popped up, I want to talk about the bureaucratic piece for a minute. So I'm rail, there were airline guys there, there was rental car people there, the bus people were there. There's really anybody you could imagine. So the first thing we wanted to do was to get data from the various Department of Transportation modal agencies about travel patterns and, volumes of trips and all the kinds of things you might expect. And what we found was, number one, all of those modal agencies collect and do their own data, but at the same time, they don't share it to the point where DOT at the DOT level does its own data on top of that. So we were sitting here trying to get data, and there was an argument within DOT about whose data to get and how we would get it. So they're not even talking to each other. So we're trying to come up with this sort of unified grand theory of transportation, and the modal agencies aren't talking to each other. And that's just bureaucratic stuff. That's a story that's as old as administrative empire building. That goes back a long way. So there were all these sort of barriers that we've put up around ourselves to stop ourselves from having real conversations about how to do things better. And there's a real addiction to status quo thinking. And I think that is true in rail. I think it's true in aviation. I think it's true in housing. I think it's true in almost every element of American life that we look at and say, you know what, this is not working the way it should. It's because we have trained ourselves to say no. We have trained ourselves to say, we have built this structure and this is the way it has to be. And we're terrified to look at doing something different. That's the fight that I fight more than anything else. Do I fight on Surface Transportation Reauthorization? Yes. Do we fight on appropriations? Yes. Do we fight on getting investment money for new Amtrak fleet? Yes. We do all of those sort of things, but those are all tactical, right? Those are all sort of individual things. The thing that we've really got to break through in this country is this idea that the status quo is where we have to be, because it's not.
No, and no status quo stays the status quo anyway. So the change is inevitable. This is not inevitable. And you really get to the heart of the matter. And I think you also kind of really touched why, as a social change activist, I have been so drawn to rail. It is not just a political problem. It is also a spiritual problem. Our capacity to connect with each other, our capacity to build community, our desire to connect with each other and build community with each other is deeply related to this. And you've gone into a very profound place, I think, in this conversation. I know we're going to climb our way out of it into some of the policy tools that are tactics, part of a strategy to build towards a vision. But understanding that there's a vision where we're more connected to each other, where infrastructure serves to expand benefits and reduce harms. That's the vision. And that's also the economy that's more sustainable and more resilient and more robust. Rail Passengers Association is one of the leaders in explaining the multiplier effect of having passenger trains and having more and more service and how that helps communities build their local economy. So you all are championing that. You're overcoming this idea that the trains themselves have to make a profit or pay for their infrastructure service. So you're already doing a great job with that. There is something about advocating around rail that allows us to talk with different people than we would normally talk to. And I think that's one of the things I value most. And I feel like when you say that this conversation, honestly, you know what? I studied philosophy in college many years ago, and I took American philosophy. And I do have a bit of a sense of the Max Weber and the Protestant work, the spirit of capitalism.
Boy, that takes me back.
Yeah, I'm telling you, man, here we go. But I would make the argument that in that worldview, inequality is actually a sacrament, that the system is set up to build that inequality. And I know this is a bit far afield, so I don't want to get too down this rabbit hole, but there's something that's really keeps us from connecting with each other when we're all in competition with each other rather than having the opportunity to collaborate with each other. And so fighting that battle does feel like the fundamental fight. We fight all these other tactical things and little strategies and campaigns, but fundamentally, this is about connection, and our power and our sense of community and our sense of unity as a nation are about how do we connect to each other? How do we connect to the places that we are? And how do we celebrate and sow that connection for future generations? That is a hell of a task to undertake, but honestly, in a way, it's the only task worth doing.
Oh, it is. And I would take your point just one step further. It's not just how do we connect, it's why do we connect? Because I think one of the things we have to overcome right now is the sense that we don't have to connect. There are people who don't deserve it. You know, connection is for us, not for them. Whoever the us is and whoever the them is up for debate. But there is this sense that we don't need to serve rural America because nobody lives there. Well, hold on. Somebody lives there. It might not be 11 million people like you have in, you know, a large metropolitan area like New York or Philadelphia, but they're still humans. They're still Americans. They need to get places. And do you really want grandma with her cataracts and her medical oxygen getting in the car and getting out on the highway where she's 17 times more likely to be killed than on a train? But we get into these value judgments. America is just obsessed with value judgments about people and about worthiness. And that's really sort of the sub rosa to all the conversations that I tend to have about rail investment in the United States, because the sort of unspoken thing is, well, we'll spend money on these people, but we don't want to spend money on those people.
Right.
Well, who do you mean by those? Well, you know, those people. It sounds abstract to talk about the philosophy of connecting America, but it's very real. It's very concrete. It's very meaningful to the person in Montana who has to drive for 6 hours in a place where it snows in May to get to some little airport to take the dangerous flight that costs many, many hundreds of dollars to some other rural place, when we could just as easily serve them on a train that is going to be safer and more comfortable and all the rest. But we get into this mindset that, well, there's no profit in that. So what? Grandma should be able to get places. The disabled veteran should be able to get places. The student should be able to get places.
We'll spend tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars in foreign occupations and adventurism to serve a handful of gigantic corporations and their, control over our energy, but we won't invest in grandma and our kids? What the hell?
Because she's not profitable. What's the ROI on grandma?
Right.
And that is really, I mean, it sounds a little glib, but honestly, it all starts with this value judgment about what we as a country should be spending taxpayer dollars to do. And there is a real disconnect between people who are actually in charge of spending those dollars and the people who are contributing those dollars on what it should be spent on. At the strategic level, that's the idea we have to overcome. And, I want an intermodal transportation strategy for the United States that includes aviation, that includes barges, that includes bikes, that includes buses, and it includes passenger rail. But to do that, we have to take 2 steps back and explain to people why the people who take those modes should even get service at all. And, you asked me earlier about other countries versus us. Well, in those other countries, there's an assumption that everybody deserves mobility. And the challenge is, how do we deliver it? Do we deliver it through a for-profit mechanism? Do we do it as a public-private partnership? Do we do it as a strictly government supply? Those are debates. Those are tactics. But the core fundamental idea that everybody ought to be able to get around is not up for debate. And in this country, it is, because we make value judgments about whether certain people or classes of people should get served at all. And as the years have gone on, we have ever narrowed the category of people that we think deserve whatever we're talking about. If you tried to book an airline flight in the last, say, 6 months, The big innovation a couple of years ago was Economy Plus, right? Where you're still sitting in coach, but you get an extra 2 inches. Ooh. And for that, you pay an extra $125. Well, now we're at a place where the things that you used to get as a coach passenger or even an Economy Plus passenger, you now have to book business class to get. And you're going to get an extra 3 inches in business class, and you're going to pay thousands of dollars for a ticket that used to cost $400. And part of that is to cover the increase in the fuel costs and some of the other things. But some of that is just further atomizing the audience, atomizing the marketplace, atomizing the customer base, so that you get to a place where only rich people get served. And Delta has been very transparent about this. They've told the Wall Street analysts during their quarterly calls, we're getting better than 50% of our revenues from 10% of travelers. So that's who we're going to take care of. So the rest of you, you're barely worth our time. And so the more that attitude takes precedence, the more trouble we're going to have justifying any kind of investment in anybody's mobility. And it's the reason why, and this is going to sound strange coming from a passenger rail advocate, but this is why our roads are bad too. Because who cares about, East Armpit, Indiana, wherever? Well, they're people too. And they shouldn't have to only rely on a toll road to get around. But if you don't do that, you get potholes the size of Mars. And we do this everywhere in the country. And one of the things that we're discovering when the World Cup people come to visit this country is they are astonished at the degree to which infrastructure in this country is deteriorated, so that there are certain places where everything's nice, but the vast majority of the country has potholed roads, has electrical wires up on poles where they come down in the windstorms. Close to 500 hospitals have closed around the country. You can look at almost any element of infrastructure or support structure, and we just don't want to spend the money, because ideologically we have decided that nobody deserves it. And that is an incredibly difficult thing for us to overcome. And that is why I've made a point of trying to argue from the tactical level that, Senator, Congressperson, whoever, this is going to make your town better. And here's how it's going to make it better. And kind of work from the bottom up. Because this philosophical conversation is one that I don't think most of America is ready to have.
So I think that's a reasonable place to pivot back to the tactical then. I really appreciate you taking the time to go into this topic. I mean, I'm reading a book on Reconstruction and post-Civil War. So you bring up a lot of things that resonate and could distract me very far afield. So I'm going to do our best to come back to, you talked about people have their little silos. You didn't use that word, but I think of the siloization of whether that be the nonprofit world or whether that be the government entities and agencies, the committee structures, the academia. Everybody's been sort of put in these silos. So it's very difficult to have interdisciplinary solutions to interdisciplinary problems when you're so fragmented. But it did feel that the arc of the last, say, 15 to 20 years, the Surface Transportation Reauthorization was starting to branch out beyond what it originally undertook. Of course, the world's changing. We had an Interstate Commerce Commission. Lots of things change over that arc. But could you just bring us through the last few Surface Transportation Reauthorization efforts and the role of rail and how it's increased or expanded or contracted?
Okay, so I don't want to go too far into history, only because we will do what we just did, and I'll spend another 2 hours talking about it, but I do think it's fascinating. So let's go a couple of bills backwards, right? So let's start with the really basic thing, which I know you know this, but I suspect there are people out there in listener land who might not know this. So anytime the federal government spends money, you have to have two things. You have to have an authorization and an appropriation. They're two different things, and they come from two different parts of the Congress. The Constitution says that the Congress gets to decide how we spend money. That's the power of the purse. But the way they do that is it's a two-step process. There's a part of Congress that authorizes it. It says, yes, you can go do this. And this is the dollar framework we want you to operate in. And then over on the other side, you've got the appropriators. And the appropriators are the ones who decide how much is actually going to be spent on those things that are authorized. So the authorization is a 5-year bill. The appropriations, the money bill, is an annual process. So you've already disconnected the authorization from appropriations. You've already disconnected the, hey, it's okay to do this, from the, here's the money to do it. So that's already a problem. But then let's go further and recognize that in surface authorization, we spent a lot of years, many, many years, without a surface authorization bill at all. And there were just a lot of continuing extensions of authorizations and so forth. So the first time we really got serious about having a legitimate authorization was, I would say, around probably 2012 was when we had a legitimate. People will argue there were other bills, and there were, but there's a reason why the AP style book for many years told reporters to refer to this on second reference as the highway bill, because that's what it was. It was nominally the surface transportation bill, but it was really a highway bill. It was focused on highways and highway funding and highway policy. The MAP 21, which was in 2012, and that's the Moving Ahead for Progress in the 21st Century Act, MAP 21. They always struggle to come up with these cool little initialisms for these bills. But that was where we sort of got back on track with creating a real authorization. And then that was followed in 2015 with the Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, the FAST Act. Now, I came into the association in 2014, just a few months before FAST Act passed. And we counted the FAST Act as something of a victory because it had a rail title in it. It basically acknowledged rail's right to exist, and it set policy for rail within the context of a surface transportation, which sounds like a super wonky, nerdy point, and who cares? But that really was important for creating a federal focus on passenger rail policy and on rail policy generally. It really acknowledged that rail is part of the transportation infrastructure of the ecosystem in the United States, and it needs to be addressed. So that was a really important victory. But then the real important victory came in November of 2021, and that was when President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA. It was called that right up until it got signed, and then after it got signed, it became the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And that's important. The bipartisan part of that is important because it was truly bipartisan. Republicans and Democrats supported this bill. And the IIJA, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, was genuinely transformative for certainly passenger rail in the United States. It had two things which were really unusual. One, it had advanced appropriations. Now, remember, we talked about that difference between authorization says it's okay to spend it. Appropriations is where you actually get another committee to give you the money. So uniquely, the IIJA included about 2/3 of the money as an advanced appropriation. So it was guaranteed money. You didn't have to go every year to Congress and say, well, remember that thing we talked about? Can we have some of that money? And you may or may not get the money you asked for. The IIJA had that money baked in. It was $66 billion in guaranteed money for passenger rail for 5 years. Never before, ever, had we had that. It is hard to overstate how important that was, because for the first time, Amtrak didn't have to wonder if it was okay to start something because, next October they might take it away. If you're Alstom or Siemens or Wabtec or any of the other people that are building stuff for passenger rail, you didn't have to say to yourself, well, I don't know if this is really going to happen or not, because you knew you had at least 5 years to work on, which meant you did have the green light to go build a new plant and hire more workers and do the things that long-term planning demands that you do. And so, sure enough, you see a Siemens plant opening in North Carolina. You see Siemens building a plant in Horseheads, New York. You see the Alstom folks who have been in Hornell, New York for many years, opening a brand new plant 4 to build the next generation of Accelas. And this is a part of the state that it's very rural, has a very long history in passenger rail and in rail technology. It's a very rural place. So, I mean, we're talking about a factory that quite literally rescued the town of Hornell. It gave Hornell a lifeline that it didn't used to have. And you see that repeated all over the country in the places where these investments were made. So again, the kind of certainty that this created, unprecedented, never happened before. And so that alone made it transformative. But then the amounts of money as well. We've never spent money like that on passenger rail in the United States at one time, certainly by the federal government. Never. And if you added the authorized amounts, meaning the amounts that you could go ask for from the appropriators, and the guaranteed money that was already in the advanced appropriation, you add that together, it was $101 billion of spending over 5 years on US passenger rail. Never in the history of the United States have we spent like that on passenger rail. Truly transformative. And now that we're at the end of that 5-year period, you look and see what actually went out the door. It was pretty close to that. It was about $98 billion between the advanced appropriations and the appropriations that came out each year. We got to about 98 of the $101 billion. That's a pretty significant and transformative amount of money. And it's why we're building aero train sets to replace the Amtrak 1 and 2 fleets. It's why we have the next generation of Accelas entering service in the Northeast Corridor. It's why we have a procurement underway right now to replace the Superliner bi-level long-distance fleet. It's why we have the work getting done on tunnels that go back to the Civil War era. All of these things are possible because of that kind of capital investment. And this is not limited to the Northeast Corridor. We're talking about bridges in North Carolina and Tennessee. The next generation of Acela alone is built in 31 states. So we're not talking about, oh, that's just for New Yorkers or that's just for people in Washington. No, it's far from it. A majority of American states have a piece of the procurement for the next generation of Acela, just as an example. So incredibly transformative, incredibly important. And advanced appropriations is not like, it certainly was never done in passenger rail, but this was not some brand new crazy thing that was invented because Amtrak Joe was in the White House.
How so?
Advanced appropriations have existed for decades on the military side. If you're the Navy, you counted on advanced appropriations with 3-year funding life to buy F-18 Hornets or AV-8B Harriers. If you're the Air Force, you expected advanced appropriations for B-2s or for F-117s or for F-16s. So I say that because it means that we have a legal framework, a statutory framework, and an administrative framework that already exists to deal with advanced appropriations. It's not new. It's not something that was just invented. There's a lot of history with it. So when people say, oh, we couldn't do that, was crazy. It's been done a bunch of times. It's just this time we did it for passenger rail, and that was a first. So now let's fast forward to.
Pardon me 1 second. I just want to add that it seems like that was inspiring. Like that actually inspired people to think beyond the status quo.
It did.
I was involved in some of the process of creating the All Aboard Act. And I know you all were part of that as well. And to me, that seemed like the next step towards building upon what was accomplished by the IIJA. And we could have been doing that. And one would think that the next Surface Transportation Reauthorization bill would continue to expand the scope of the reauthorization to more integrate rail into the national rail policy and our investments in such. The Congressional Research Service published a report talking about what could be in this reauthorization. And when I read that, I think in May, I was very heartened because it really broadened the scope of what we could be considering legitimate content, including regulating the service of the freight rail system, which is not a topic we're going to get into today, but that would have been a new area to expand into as we see the Union Pacific Norfolk Southern proposed merger. It would be a really timely moment to clarify the role of the Surface Transportation Board and what is reliable service and protect shippers and others from retaliation, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a moment leading up to now when there was a potential for this reauthorization to continue to move us towards a strategy that could provide a foundation for that vision that we have for a country that's more connected, et cetera. What did we get instead? Oh, and speaking of acronyms, building unrivaled infrastructure and long-term development for America's 250th Act. Wow, that one's
Build 250.
Yeah, in short, Build 250. But today is the first time I really looked at the acronym and I'm like, oh, wow, they really stretched. They worked hard on that one.
They always do. But you're right. What we got was a huge step backwards. And I have a very sort of nuanced take on this bill. And I'll tell you why. We asked for a lot of policy to go into that bill. A lot of it did not get in, some of it did. But the reality of the American political and legislative system is that if you are in the minority and you're trying to get policy into a bill, it's very, very difficult for minority to get their stuff into a bill.
The minority party. So in this situation.
Yes, right. Minority party. And they fought very hard to get some good policy into this bill. And they did. They did. And so I think it feels bad for them when they work for 18 months to get a few crumbs into the bill that we've been asking for. And then the bill comes out and we can't come out and say we wholeheartedly support it, or even we support it, but we think it should be changed. It's a gut punch for them. And I totally understand that. And I have a lot of sympathy for that. But the fact is that the Build 250 Act, as currently written, is a step backwards. It's a huge step backwards. And in some ways, we knew this was coming. The conversations with staff suggested that maybe attitudes had softened, but Chairman Sam Graves of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee said early on that what he wanted was a clean highway bill. That was the words he used. So that was sort of the flag right there that this was the direction this was going. And our conversations with staff were very positive, both minority staff and majority staff. So we kind of felt like, okay, maybe we're sort of moving that needle a little bit. Right. But the bill, as it comes out, there's $64 billion for rail programs in the Build America 250 Act, okay? Sounds like a lot of money, but it's actually a 38% decrease from the IIJA. Now, is this more money than rail was getting before the IIJA? Yeah, it is. And if we had never had the IIJA in the first place as sort of a benchmark, we might have looked at this and said, wow, there's some pretty decent policy in this, and this is a decent amount of money. We might be okay. But there's no advanced appropriations. And for us, that's crucial. There's not a single dollar of dedicated funding for rail. It means that the Appropriations Committee has to come in and use the annual budgeting process to find around $13 billion a year for rail programs that the Build 250 Act authorized. And appropriators have struggled to get above $3 billion. So the authorization in this case is so disconnected from reality. It's an IOU, it just doesn't actually do this. And then if you look at the combination of the IIJA actual appropriations and the advanced appropriations, and you compare it to sort of Build 250 as you look at that forward, it works out to an 80% reduction in funding for rail programs altogether. So, maybe we're in a time of fiscal constraint and, the top lines were lower, so you have to really deal with this. Well, actually, no, because the Build 250 shovels even more money into the Highway Trust Fund, but it doesn't try to do anything to find user fees to pay for it.
Wow.
So, the revenue shortfall in the Highway Trust Fund, like we were talking about earlier, how we just keep shoveling money into it. If you look at the extra above baseline spending out of the trust fund in the Build 250 Act, the Highway Trust Fund revenue shortfall would grow by around $38 billion over the next 5 years.
Could you say that one more time? Could you say that one more time? I want to
Sure.
understand that.
So if you look at the extra above baseline spending out of the trust fund that the Build 250 Act authorizes, so that's above the regular sort of what we already spend every year in the formula funding that we hand out for highways, that above baseline spending would increase the revenue shortfall in the Highway Trust Fund by $38 billion over the next 5 years.
So the subsidization of roads has increased.
Will grow under the Build 250 Act.
But we're doing nothing to reduce the amount of congestion on those roads, investment in the rail infrastructure as alternatives for freight or people. I mean, we're not necessarily nothing, but nothing near. If we were following a trajectory that the IIJA set up and things like the Corridor ID program, which had people planning projects with the idea that we'd be expanding service and actually investing not just in planning and engineering, but actually building stuff, it's a profound disappointment.
It is. It is. And that is why, as much as we want to publicly praise some of the staffers on the committee who got some policy objectives of ours into the bill, and we are grateful for that. I'm not saying we're not, but from the IIJA baseline, you're cutting 80% of rail funding, and you're increasing the highway spending from the Highway Trust Fund that is already insolvent. You're adding to the insolvency by $38 billion. The message is just so clear. These guys see highways and roads as a core federal priority, and they treat intercity passenger rail as a state-level vanity project that Congress will play along with, but only up to a point.
Yeah, we had a similar experience of getting a seemingly unrelated, but something we care about, a transmission study bill, didn't even have any money involved in it, into this reauthorization. It was to look at co-locating electric transmission on rail and highway rights of way. And yeah, I'm very grateful to the staff who did so much work to craft that legislation and then to find the vehicle for moving it forward. But that work is not for naught. The education process, the relationship building that all of the staff people engaged in, the conversations they had across offices and across committees, perhaps, to bring things along, that's a great foundation for whatever comes next.
It is.
It's not like we lose all of that progress if we don't approve of something that's going to be setting us back. But right now, this is a 5-year at least commitment, and it kind of locks us into something.
If it passes,
we'd be locked into something that is holding us back.
Yes.
It's really constraining us. And so what do you think? How do we respond to this at this moment?
So let me pick up on two things you said. One, you're 100% right that the effort's not wasted. The education is there. The staff now knows more than they did before it started. You know, I tell people this all the time about the IIJA, about the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. That work didn't start in 2021. And that work did not start when Joe Biden was inaugurated. You know, there are a lot of people that, oh, we got Amtrak, Joe in the White House, so now we got this bill. It was 8 years of education and chipping away at these ideas in Congress to get to a place where the IIJA could be truly bipartisan and get buy-in from both sides of the aisle. So all of those 8 years led to that moment. Did it pick up steam during that 2021 year? Yes, of course it did. I would be lying if I said that that wasn't the case. But let's not pretend that suddenly, you know, the magic fairy came and tapped everyone in Congress on the head and they said, oh, this is a good idea. That is not how any of this works. The people who are involved in advocacy every day know this, that this is an incredibly long game. And you have to be satisfied with that slow, steady progress, which feels so frustrating sometimes because you feel like you're not getting anywhere. But if we had not put the hard work in during FAST Act and even before it, we would not have gotten the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law signed in 2021. And so I think we're kind of in the same place now with the Build 250 Act. There's some good things in it, there's some not good things in it, and we have to continue the conversation and help people understand with facts and with data and with reality and experience, not with ideology and not with how I personally feel about any of it, but just show people, look, this money is building things. This is doing the stuff that we said we all need to get done. We're taking 115-year-old tunnels and we're fixing them. We just have to use that and show that and help people understand that this Build 250 Act is just not ready. It's not ready. And it's because it's not ready, we have to try again. And because we're close to the midterms, we're not going to be able to try again until later, probably after the midterms. But we have to try again, and we have to keep having the conversation. We can't just walk away and say, okay, we're done and we didn't get what we wanted. You have to stay engaged. And that's the hard part of advocacy. It's so hard for people to recognize that sometimes you got to keep getting back in that ring, even when you get punched in the nose. You got to do it again and again. And it feels futile until that end product comes out and you can look at it and say, you know what, we got some things we wanted.
Right. And also it gives us the opportunity to really identify what are the other things that are missing that we want. The All Aboard Act, I would say, it was just one of the components that Solutionary Rail would like to see integrated. I don't think that I could do a very good job articulating what the All Aboard Act does in its entirety. It's a pretty broad bill, but I do understand that there's dedicated funding. It creates a dedicated funding stream for rail and for passenger rail. And I don't know if there's anything more that you could speak to, but I invite you to speak to other details, things that you would like to see in a reauthorization that's worth passing.
Sure. So, I mean, you touched on one of which I think is sort of a holy grail, right? Is the predictable dedicated funding for passenger rail. Whatever happens with the Highway Trust Fund, which we now know is insolvent, we're shoveling money into it every year that is not gas tax money because it is insolvent. And despite that, every state DOT in the country knows that little magic check is going to arrive next year for their roads and their bridges and their highways. And from a purely political standpoint, what a gift to states to have this money show up that says you can spend it however you want. So this is, from a political standpoint, a way of states being able to spread the wealth however they feel they need to spread it. And this is happening with a fund that is insolvent. So look at what happens when you have predictable, dedicated funding. Compare that with, like I said earlier, the transformational effect of finally, after decades and decades, having at least a 5-year predictable funding stream for passenger rail. Look at everything that blossomed as a result of that. Bridges, highways, real work getting done by real people in 31 states. Depending on which study you look at, could be 40 states. And we're talking about steel, we're talking about engineering, we're talking about actual stuff getting made in the United States by people who live here, work here, and pay their taxes here. And making stuff that isn't just making stuff for the sake of it, but actually making the bridges safer, more sound, making the tunnels so that they don't leak, replacing train cars that are half a century old. I mean, I could just go on, but you can point to actual things that got done. That happens when you can know with certainty that money is coming. And so the predictable, dedicated funding source is just foundational to any kind of progress that we're going to make in passenger rail or even transit in the United States. Nothing else happens without it. And that's why that is so important. The mechanisms, we can quibble about how it gets done, how it gets funded, that's fine. That's a policy debate, and that's worth having. But we have to find a way in the next authorization to guarantee a certain level of funding for passenger rail investment and transit investment anywhere in the United States so that we can continue to move forward. That is an absolute foundational point. It has to be in there. Another thing that I think is crucial, that I think Build 250 really missed the mark on. So we've been talking up to now about investing in the system that we have, fixing 116-year-old tunnels, fixing bridges that are rusting and crumbling into the rivers, replacing 50-year-old train cars, all those kinds of things. But there's a whole other section of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law that was created called the Corridor Identification Program. And Corridor ID was about the future. If we're talking about the part of the bill that paid for today's stuff, you had Corridor ID looking at tomorrow's stuff. And it was new routes, new service, extending service where it already exists, but it was future, it was growth, it was expansion. In the very first phase of the Corridor ID program, 69 corridors, potential corridors were chosen for federal examination, and they were funded to do that. 69 corridors. Now, are all 69 going to happen? Probably not, but at least it's a pipeline of actual work and actual projects to really grow passenger service in the United States. So the Bill 250 took a look at that CID program, which I think was constructed in a way that makes it move too slowly, 6 separate phases in Corridor ID. And at the end of each phase, you have to get a new contract with the Federal Railroad Administration to proceed to the next phase. It is about as slow as molasses in the winter. And the folks writing the Bill 250 Act looked at that and said, that Corridor ID thing, it is moving way too fast. We got to pump the brakes.
Oh, no.
And that's what they did. I mean, no one has ever accused the CID program of moving fast. If anything, stakeholders have complained to FRA, and I've been on those calls saying, guys, can we please streamline this? Can we please allow simultaneous work on different phases? Can we at least get credit for previous work done? All these different ways to try to get this thing moving quicker. So Bill 250 has reforms to the CID that adds more analysis layers, a deeper look at ridership and balance sheets, makes a big deal about how potential corridors have to get more non-federal funding. They have to examine no-build options. And Bill 250 permanently closes the Corridor ID pipeline after 2031. So no more growth after that. Well, holy Toledo, man. That is the worst possible thing you could do to this planning pipeline for future expansion of passenger rail. Can you imagine if we had said to the highway people, the next time you want to add a lane, we're going to make you do a ridership analysis to show how many people are really going to use it and whether that actually makes money or not. And you have to have more money that's not federal money to build that lane. All those things. Can you imagine if we said that to the highway community? Their hair would just burst into flames and they wouldn't do it. And yet we're going to layer this onto this Corridor ID program, which was developed by Republicans and Democrats in the 2021 Congress. It's just one of the worst pieces of policy we've seen in this bill. So that's an example of something that's got to come out, because that future, that Corridor ID is the future of passenger rail in the United States. And Bill 250 would cap it at 2031 and meanwhile kneecap all 69 projects that are already in the pipeline by making them meet an impossible standard.
Oh, that's terrible. Yeah. So this thing has got, and we don't want whatever they came up with to be the model. Even if we defeat it, say, if it gets through the House, then are you concerned that it'll become in the next Congress the model that they'll build upon? Or
I am. I think that there was a genuine desire on both the minority and majority of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee to portray this as a bipartisan bill. And if you look at the statements that came out, the official statements that came out from the T&I committee when the bill language was published, it had both Sam Graves and Ranking Member Larson in the statement, kind of both saying, gee, isn't this a swell bill? And so I think that if this is the baseline, we have a lot of work to do when we go back and readdress it. But as I said a few minutes ago, I think that's the only option, is to go back and readdress it. The question is, do we start from scratch or do we start with this as a baseline? I think there is a risk that we start with this as a baseline just because this is 18 months of work. And a lot of people put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into building this. And there's going to be just the natural human instinct to start with this and fiddle with it. But when I look at the Corridor ID stuff, when I look at a lot of the policy provisions that either didn't make it or were half baked. When I look at the lack of advanced appropriations, we just got to start over. There's a point where the sunk cost fallacy comes in. You just have to recognize that, you know what? We did not build the right foundation. We got to rip this out and start again. And that's our position going into this, is that we need a new bill. We need a different bill. We need a different baseline. I think that there is a significant risk that we don't get that. I think there is a significant risk that this remains the baseline for whatever succeeds the bipartisan infrastructure law. And if that's the case, then, okay, but we're going to bring in a lot of drywall and a lot of lumber and a lot of stuff to make this different, because as it stands, this bill is just not good enough.
It really is frustrating to me that Congressman Larson has this attitude of that anything is better than nothing, when this is such a huge step backwards. It doesn't give me great hope that T&I under other leadership is all of a sudden going to turn things around and see the light. I don't see our champions there, and that's concerning. And I live in the state where Congressman Larson is based, so that concerns me deeply. I think that there's also opportunity to build coalition to start over. I don't want to have to try to think of an acronym for Reconnect America, but I'd love to see a Reconnect America bill.
Yes.
It talks about the vision that we have, the strategy to get there, and the tactics that need to be utilized to make progress. And, I think that at the moment where we have this proposed gigantic merger takeover, however you want to characterize it, this proposed takeover of Norfolk Southern by Union Pacific, that this is a moment where there are unlikely allies. There's the potential for an unconventional alliance to say, you know what? No, we need a rail system for the future. We need it to be integrated into our transportation policy and into our transportation system in a way that delivers benefits, that spreads benefits, and reduces harms. We don't need a contraction in the Surface Transportation Reauthorization. We need an expansion of it. And you were sort of hinting earlier that sort of clean highway bill, that was the rumor that there was not going to be any rail title.
That's right.
So they got the rail title, and congratulations, they got the safety bill as more or less written by the Association of American Railroads. But we need so much more than that. We need to decide that rail is a critical part of our national infrastructure, and we need to plan for it over the long term. So I think that shippers, rail passengers, rail labor, folks who care about electrification and transmission, rural places, it seems to me like we could use this as an opportunity, as a platform for building out these relationships and a vision for the next Congress.
We absolutely could, and we should. And I guess this goes back to the point we were trying to discuss earlier about vision and status quo and willingness to challenge the status quo. We have to break out of this idea that there's only one way to do this, and there's only one way to look at what is possible. Because the fact is that anything is possible if we decide enough people care about it and enough people want to pay for it. And I go back to this example a lot. I was involved in the Federal Railroad Administration's long distance study. It was finally published early on in the second Trump administration, but the work took place for about 2 years during the Biden administration. And it was a phenomenal piece of work. It identified 15 potential new long distance routes to layer on top of the long distance routes that already exist. It would have added 60 million people to the service area that is now covered by Amtrak. It would have added hundreds of billions of dollars of GDP to the United States. There's just a million things about it that were really good. But that report said that we could expect to start new service between 2040 and 2060. And we're talking about putting trains on tracks that already exist, where trains already run today. And literally, the day I returned home from the workshop series that presented that draft result to those of us working on it was the very same day that a company called Intuitive Machines landed a scientific lander on the moon. And why do I bring that up? Because the lander project took 6 years. It took 6 years. And we went from, on the Lander project, people sitting around drawing up plans on a napkin. And this is a true story. This is not this is true. Drawing up plans on a napkin, getting the contract from NASA, inventing brand new technology to get this lander built, launched, and on the surface of the moon. It took 6 years to do that. 6 years. And meanwhile, we're saying the earliest we could get anything out of the long distance studies, 2040, and it could be as late as 2060. For projects that are not building new greenfield track, they're going to run trains in places where trains already run. And meanwhile, the Intuitive Machines people put their lander onto the moon's south pole for about what it would cost to buy 16 new rail cars by 2035.
It's insane. It's crazy making, and some people say, "Oh, that's government for you." Well, not really.
It was a government contract. NASA
right?
paid for that. Yes.
And we have a history of doing that. We need an Apollo level approach to this. We don't need this sort of kick the can down the road approach. We need to treat it with seriousness and urgency. We got to go back to the drawing board on this stuff. And I'm somewhat hopeful that the proposed merger is an opportunity for us to have that conversation, because it does feel like, as Byron Porter put it, an end game moment for rail. It does give us the opportunity to take this system apart and say, what is infrastructure for? What is our rail infrastructure for? What's its fundamental purpose? And when we talk about things like efficiency, what do we mean by efficiency? And efficiency for whom? And what is the actual purpose? But we have to build those relationships to do that. So maybe each platform, whether it be the reauthorization and the fight against this merger that you've written about and its potential impact on passenger rail, maybe these are the platforms upon which we build a movement to reconnect America.
100%, because people will tell you, whether they're Republicans or Democrats or independents or DSA or whatever they are, most people will tell you they want a reconnected America. They want the ability to choose how to travel. They want to be able to make those trips safely, cleanly, quickly, all of that. They want that. We did some public polling, and we did this with an independent firm, so this wasn't us putting our thumb on the scale, about what people would be willing to invest in passenger rail for the purpose of reconnecting America. And we found that 61% of Republicans and 94% of Democrats would support investing $100 billion with a B on passenger rail expansion. 61% of Republicans. So, again, this idea that, well, this is a Democratic sort of idea fix. No, it's not. It enjoys bipartisan support. People want to take trains, and every time they're made available, people take them to the point where there's no more tickets to be sold. And that is true throughout the system, and it's true not just for Amtrak trains, but for Brightline trains too. So this is not about Amtrak. This is not about Brightline. This is not about anything like that. This is about what Americans want to do and are willing to pay for if we could just get out of our own way and agree that reconnecting America is important, that it is valuable, that it is meaningful, that it makes our country better, and it makes us worthy of what we say we are.
Wow, Jim, we've had a long conversation, and that just seems like a beautiful way to end it. We could talk about lots of things. There's lots of tactical questions around equipment pools and this thing and that thing, and et cetera, Amtrak reorganization, et cetera. But I think you really just nailed it with that. And we've already spent a lot of time. So I really thank you for being willing to go to the heart of the matter and do this deep dive into why passenger rail service and railroads are critical for helping us be the country that we claim to be.
That's it. That's exactly it. And we want to talk about some nitty gritty stuff, just have me back and we can do that.
Okay. All right. Wow. Thanks so much. I really appreciate you very much, Jim.
No, this was fun. As you can tell, I actually really enjoy talking about this stuff. And as I said at the beginning, I will do this until forcibly stopped. So,
you pretty much wowed me. I was not expecting us to go to that depth. And I really appreciate you sharing this thought that this could be public infrastructure. Because, to me, that's kind of the only thing that makes sense. You treat it like a steel interstate, you let people compete with service, and you don't make them pay for or control the infrastructure. And it's like, why would we not put that on the menu? And I feel like it's time that gets on the menu, and it can't just be Railroad Workers United, DSA, Public Rail Now, and Solutionary Rail. I think it's good that we are talking about it because I think it opens up. People don't have to be the crazy in the room, right? But if we don't start talking about that, I don't know how we're going to get the rest of the system that we want and need if that's at least not part of the conversation.
Yep. We've got to get past things that are left coded or right coded. Right. We've just got to recognize that this is what humans want. And I mean, let's be real. Italy right now has a right-wing government philosophically. That is where they are. They are a right-wing government. Do you see them dismantling their national rail systems? No.
Right.
No. You see a combination of public-private partnership. You see private operators operating on publicly owned and controlled infrastructure. So again, it does not have to be about ideology. It doesn't have to be either right-coded or left-coded. It's just sensible. It's just, how do you get people where they got to go so they can do the stuff they got to do? It is so basic. It does not have to carry so much ideological weight. And we've just gotten to a place now where everything is so coded that way that we just can't have grown-up conversations anymore, which is why I had so much fun today, because we were able to just talk.
Awesome. Well, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope you get out there to do your primary voting. And
that's right. Gotta go get my vote.
Right on. Okay, brother. Well, thank you again. I'm honored and grateful to be able to engage with you on this, because there are very few people who could speak as eloquently as yourself. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. We're all in this together, right?
That is true. All right.
All right.
Take care, brother.
Take care, man. Bye.
That was Rail Passengers Association President Jim Matthews in conversation with Solutionary Rail Director and Reconnect America host Bill Moyer. This conversation was edited for clarity and brevity by me, Sasha Elenko. Thank you to Oda Proda for the theme music. You can find this show on Substack, Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. You may have noticed that this podcast doesn't have ads or a paywall. With your help, we can keep it that way. Pitch in and get involved by visiting solutionaryrail.org. We're not here to sell you anything. We are here to build a movement.